Hi, I'm Mark, and I like to talk about UK politics and, yes, Brexit from an outside view. Although I do know the UK from the inside as well, don't worry. All of Europe is moving to the right. That's what people say, but is it all of Europe? No. An island populated by unpredictable monarchists is apparently returning remorsefully to the political center. Kind of. And it all happened very quickly. The polling stations in Great Britain had barely closed on that Thursday evening when the result was announced. And on Friday, Rishi Sunak said, "I'm sorry," and was gone. The television was already showing his successor Keir Starmer in Buckingham Palace with King Charles. And dozens of cameras teams gathered in front of 10 Downing Street, government employees lined up to welcome their new boss to his new home. One can only hope that there was at least enough time to change the bed linen for the Starmers. Here, coalition negotiations take weeks or months here in Germany, and in America, Donald Trump encouraged his people to storm the Capitol before reluctantly vacating the White House. And in London? Whoosh! Within hours, the 14-year Tory rule collapses and Labour takes over. And this democratic pragmatism is remarkable. But the unspectacular sequence of events is deceptive. The British have not simply elected a different government, they have ended an era. The era of Brexit has divided the country and brought Europe to the brink of despair. And for a decade it was about leave or stay, about the question of how to get out of this dense network of treaties and regulations, principles and details, and about the consequences of Brexit for the everyday lives of the people on the island. David Cameron, who came into office as Prime Minister in 2010, had asked the British to hold a referendum on their EU membership, not because he wanted to leave the EU, but because he wanted to end the discussion about it once and for all. But the European Cameron had not reckoned with Boris Johnson, the anti-European at the time, the gifted populist and the political egomaniac. Cameron spoke about the European internal market and advantageous trade relations, showed slides and graphics. Johnson spoke about British pride, independence and national greatness, and made fun of standardized bananas, which is a lie, by the way. In June 2016, 52% of the British voters voted to leave the EU on that date. And since then, Brexit has been eating its children, and that's the Tories. Cameron resigned after the vote. Theresa May took over the office and negotiated a 585-page exit agreement with the EU in order to keep the economic consequences manageable. Johnson and his troops sensed betrayal and a Brussels dictate and were then promoting a hard Brexit. That meant May leaves and Boris Johnson himself moves into Downing Street. And in 2020, the United Kingdom formally leaves the EU. And Johnson fails in office because he's a characterless liar and a political bully. And Liz Truss, the next on the list, doesn't even last just one autumn. And Rishi Sunak is coming, but the British are now thoroughly fed up with the Tories and their illusionary theatre. The EU opponents had linked 4 key promises to Brexit, and the balance shows what a debacle they had caused. First, Brexit was supposed to give the British back their sovereignty. And during her short term in office, Liz Truss wanted to put this promise into practice. She followed in the footsteps of Margaret Thatcher, the legendary Iron Lady. Truss wanted to free the British economy from all shackles and stimulate growth. Dumping taxes for companies, favorable conditions for investors. Yeah, couldn't Britain become kind of a Singapore in Europe? Successful, orderly, deregulated? Well, no, it couldn't. The financial markets of all things rebelled against this program. The British pound plummeted, interest rates shot up, the Bank of England had to manage the crisis. And Truss was finished before she had really begun. And the British learned a lesson. Sovereignty is a tricky concept in times of a globally interconnected economy. Trust is a fleeting capital. And secondly, Britain does not need the EU to be successful on the world markets, they claimed. Less trade with the EU, so the promise goes, will be offset by more trade with the rest of the world, which is just waiting to conclude far-reaching trade agreements with the former empire. and the result was a failure. The British have concluded two new agreements with Mexico and South Korea. In both cases, they have adopted the EU treaties practically word for word without the need for Brexit. And two other agreements are new, with New Zealand and Australia. Trade with these countries is recorded in the statistics after the decimal point. And all major plans have been shelved. India, Indonesia, China, the USA. The negotiations with Canada even have failed. Splendid isolation, the retreat to one's own island, was a foreign policy principle in the late 19th century. In the 21st century, economic isolation is damaging the country. And thirdly, they promised Europe costs them £350 million every week, money that they can invest in the health system after Brexit. And this claim, or lie, prominently displayed on buses through the country, was the most ingenious move and at the same time the most infamous lie of Johnson's campaign. After Brexit, there was no more talk of the £350 million. It simply didn't exist. The state of the NHS is more desolated today than it was in 2016. And fourth promise was uncontrolled immigration, supposedly Europe's fault, was a central argument of the Leave campaign. The British have actually rewritten their laws in this area, and freedom of movement for workers from EU countries is history. And the numbers? Well, in 2019, before Brexit, the National Statistics Office registered 332,000 migrants. In 23, it was 722,000. And two-thirds of Britons now say they are disappointed with Brexit, but there is no going back. The election results suggest that the British have not lost their common sense. They turned away from the populists and voted for Labour, at least a third of them, but only after the hardcore socialist Jeremy Corbyn was replaced by the serious, dull and almost scholastic Starmer. Make Brexit work. That is how Starmer himself defines his task. But does he have a chance here? The British economy ranks at the bottom of the international growth table, along with Germany. But its situation is much worse than that of the German economy, because national debt is as high as the entire gross domestic product of a year, and according to forecasts, this negative figure will even rise. For comparison, Germany is at 63%. And this means that the financial situation of Great Britain is more comparable to that of Italy or France. The only difference is that the British have not spent money lavishly like the politicians in Rome or Paris. On the contrary, they have saved their way into the crisis. When David Cameron took office in 2010, he proclaimed the age of austerity. 14 years of Tory austerity, only briefly interrupted during the COVID period, have confirmed an old economic insight. A weak state does not automatically lead to a strong economy. And Starmer's political room for maneuver is very limited. Firstly, he needs growth. Secondly, growth. Thirdly, growth. And to reform the ailing health system, to repair the crumbling infrastructure in the north of England, and for many other projects. But he cannot take on new debts. The old ones are already too high. He does not want to raise taxes. He promised that during the election campaign. So where will the growth come from? Modernization, debureaucratization, well, these are terms from political marketing. He will try a cautious rapprochement with the EU, but that will not have much effect. Whether Labour voters or Tories, whether leave or stay, whether Brits or mainland Europeans, everyone has a reason to wish Starmer success, because the return of voters to the political centre is an experiment now, nothing more. If it succeeds, the Brits can be a role model for Europe. If not, Nigel Farage is ready. An extremist, a hardliner who thinks Brexit has failed, but only because Johnson and the Tories were supposedly too soft. So things can actually get worse if Starmer fails. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.